All right, I want to go to an issue on mental health because a recent report released by the Productivity Commission shows mental ill health and suicide is costing the Australian economy at least $200 billion a year. And that's all data collected prior to the pandemic, of course, despite the government's $10 billion annual spend on combating mental health problems. It seems a lot of people are still falling through the cracks. Now, some say the issue of mental health, that we're getting to the point that we're at risk of over-medicalising it. Now, I'm not an expert, but my next guest is psychiatrist and author Tanveer Ahmed. Tanveer, you're on the show tonight because you've written a very interesting piece today in the Australian Financial Review, warning of the implications of a growing trend of medicalising mental health. What do you mean by that?
Essentially what I mean, Peter, is nobody's saying mental health is not an important problem. It's a very important problem. There are many people who are suffering greatly and they're struggling to sort of navigate a complex system. But what's really going on, especially in Australia, but right across Western society, is that just the day-to-day problems of living are increasingly having to be talked about in the medical language. So, for example, we talk about mental health stigma. Arguably now it's actually harder for people to say that they're sad or lonely or they're feeling humiliated. And arguably it's actually easier to say they're suffering depression or they're suffering an anxiety disorder. That's actually the trends that's happening. And I'll tell you why. In some ways, as much as it's important to medicalise clinical disorders, because the term mental health is colonising more and more, not just of our private lives, but also of public debate. You'll find right throughout this COVID period, and this is in Britain as well as in Australia, barely any policy that overlapped with sort of social issues. It almost had to be justified constantly through mental health. You couldn't just say it was a good policy or that it was common sense. Again, we need good mental health policies. This report is an important one. It's a very broad report, which shows just how big this term has become, mental health. It pretty much taps into every facet of life. But one thing it does show that, like a lot of Australian problems, the problem is often about distribution. What it shows is the first fifth, the top quintile of Australians in income, they suck up any extra funding. Funding's been doubled over the last 20 years, Peter, and almost most of it's just gone in the top fifth, and outcomes haven't changed very much. So I feel like there's more and more discussion about the term mental health. And I see it in my work, I guess. A good example is in the workplace. And this overlaps with cultural issues too, Peter, about, say, victimhood or feeling marginalised, even proclaiming pain or saying you're marginalised has an element of status now. So, for example, in the workplace, 20, 30 years ago, if there was a compensation claim related to mental health, it'd be related to work pressure. So people feeling pressure to work. The same thing now, what's completely shifted is work pressure has shifted to bullying and harassment. So that's actually a good measure of cultural shifts too, that you're not going to really take it seriously unless you're kind of some sort of victim. And not only do you have to be some sort of victim, it has to turn into a mental health condition. So yeah, sorry, go, Pete.
Yeah, I just want to pick up that point because I think you're a psychiatrist, so you're a doctor who's trained in psychiatry, not a psychologist. It's a different specification or profession. But the human condition has a whole range of emotions. We can experience joy. We can be flat. Now, being flat isn't necessarily depressed and isn't necessarily mental health concerning. It could be something that passes. For every high, there's a low. It's just whenever the highs and the lows get out of kilter with what I would regard as just the experience of being a human being. And I think sometimes the rush to label it as mental health makes it difficult, particularly I think for young people, to see themselves as coming out of it, that, this too will pass. That my grandmother always used to say, this too will pass. That with time or exercise, a break, and I'm not making light of mental health here, but you're right, there are so many things that just happen to the normal rhythm of being a human being that sometimes just accepting that it's part of being human is,
well, the
is
average
getting
GP
through
now,
it.
Peter, average GP now spends almost half their time seeing people who are coming in for mental health disorders, and often it is just the day-to-day problems of living. And it's almost like it's not worthy. It's like you can't speak of any problems without. It's like it's not acceptable unless it is seen through the lens of mental health. And this is what I think we're really losing. We're getting a narrower and narrower language to discuss the human experience, and this flows through into a host of other issues, Peter, including politics.
All right, well, I'll definitely have you back before we get to the Christmas season. I know a lot of people find that tough. We'll talk more broadly about all of this, but you've got a terrific book, In Defence of Shame, out in all the bookshops right now. Tanveer Ahmed, thanks for your time.
Great to be on. Thanks, Peter.